The morning should have belonged to him. That was the expectation. That was the assumption. That was the story already forming in Napoleon's mind before the first shot was fired. But by noon, that story was collapsing. By afternoon, it was gone, and by evening, he would begin rewriting it. There are moments in history where everything balances on a single miscalculation, where power, reputation, and the illusion of control are all tested at once. June 14th, 1800, was one of those moments. Because on that day, Napoleon Bonaparte did not fight like a man in control of the battlefield. He fought like a man trying to survive it. Northern Italy, early summer. The land around Marengo is deceptive. Open fields, low ridges, thin streams cutting through farmland that seems almost peaceful at a distance. It is not the kind of terrain that announces danger, but terrain doesn't need to look dangerous to become lethal. It only needs to be misunderstood. And Napoleon had misunderstood it. 6 months earlier, he had seized power in France, not through inheritance, not through election, but through force. A coup, clean, efficient, necessary in his mind. The Republic had been unstable, directionless. He would fix that. But power taken is not power secured. For that, he needed legitimacy. And in his world, legitimacy came from victory. Austria still held northern Italy. That mattered more than maps would suggest. Italy was not just territory. It was prestige, influence. A statement that France, even after revolution, could still project power beyond its borders. If Napoleon could take Italy back, he wouldn't just win a campaign, he would silence doubts. So he did something bold. He marched an army across the Alps, not along the obvious routes, not where the Austrians were waiting. He took the difficult passes, the kind that break armies, snow, narrow paths, artillery dragged piece by piece through mountains that seemed determined to reject them. It worked. He appeared where he wasn't supposed to be, behind Austrian lines, threatening their communications, their supply routes, their control. For a moment, it looked like brilliance. And that moment shaped everything that followed. Because Napoleon believed he had forced the Austrians into retreat. That was the assumption. That was the lens through which he read every movement after crossing the mountains. He thought he was hunting them. He thought the campaign was already bending in his favor. So he spread his army out, not recklessly, but confidently. Units sent in different directions to cut off escape routes, to anticipate withdrawal, to close a net that he believed was already tightening. But the Austrians were not retreating. They were preparing. General Michael von Melas had watched Napoleon's advance carefully. He was older, experienced, not flashy, not interested in theatrics, but he understood something Napoleon, in that moment, did not. That boldness creates gaps, and gaps can be exploited. Melas made a decision. He would not retreat. He would strike. The Austrian army gathered near Alessandria, behind the Bormida River, a natural barrier, a position that concealed movement and offered a launch point. Napoleon did not see it for what it was. He saw a force preparing to withdraw. So on the morning of June 14th, his army was not concentrated. It was scattered. At dawn, the Austrians crossed the river, quietly at first, then with growing force, columns of infantry, cavalry, artillery following behind. This was not a probe. This was a full-scale attack, and it was aimed directly at the French center near the village of Marengo. The first French units encountered them with surprise, then resistance, then strain. Napoleon was not immediately on the scene. He had to be told. Reports came in, fragmented at first. Contact, pressure, engagement, then more reports, more urgency, more clarity. This was not a skirmish. This was the battle, and it had already begun without him. He moved quickly, but speed could not undo the problem, because when he arrived, the shape of the battlefield was already set. The Austrians were advancing in strength. The French were reacting, and reacting is always more expensive than initiating. The terrain began to matter. Streams that slowed movement, narrow approaches that compressed formations, villages that became choke points instead of defensive anchors. Marengo itself became a pivot point, fought over, taken, lost, retaken, but not held, never fully held. Napoleon began feeding troops into the fight. Not as a coordinated hammer, but as a series of necessary responses. Plug the gap here. Hold the line there. Delay. Absorb. Survive. Each decision made sense in isolation. Each decision made the overall situation worse, because the French army was not acting as a single force. It was being consumed in pieces. The Austrians pushed harder. Their numbers told. Their momentum built. French units fell back. Not in panic, not yet, but in stages. Under pressure. Losing ground. Always losing ground. Napoleon watched the line bend, and he understood something he had not expected to understand that day. He might lose. This is where the myth usually fractures, because we imagine great commanders as always in control, always ahead of the moment. But Marengo is the opposite. It is a man catching up to a mistake he has already made. He tried to stabilize the line. He committed reserves earlier than planned. He repositioned artillery. He sought to anchor the retreat, to prevent collapse. But stabilization requires time, and time was running out. By midday, the French position was deteriorating. The Austrians had taken key ground. Their pressure was relentless, and the French army was beginning to lose cohesion. Units that had held firm began to thin. Coordination faltered. Communication lagged. Not chaos, but something approaching it. Napoleon made a critical adjustment. He began organizing a fighting withdrawal, not a rout, not surrender, but a controlled step back. Preserve the army. Live to fight again. It was the correct decision. And it was also an admission. The battle, as planned, was lost. Across the field, Melas saw what he expected to see: the enemy giving ground, the enemy breaking contact, the enemy yielding, victory. That word began to form on the Austrian side. And that word changed everything. Because victory creates assumptions, and assumptions change behavior. Melas believed the battle was won. He had reason to believe it. The French had been pushed back for hours. Their line had retreated miles from its original position. He was old, tired. The day had been long. He handed over tactical control to subordinates, not recklessly, but decisively. And in doing so, he introduced a new variable, one he did not fully account for. Because while the Austrians advanced, something else was happening. Somewhere beyond the immediate battlefield. A column of French troops was returning. Louis Desire. He had been sent away earlier. Part of Napoleon's earlier assumption, that the Austrians were retreating, had led him to dispatch Desire to cover another direction, to block an escape that wasn't happening, which meant that for most of the day, one of Napoleon's best generals was absent, and one of his strongest formations was missing. But Desire heard the guns. He turned. He marched back. Timing. In war, timing is not just important, it is everything. He arrived in the late afternoon, and what he saw was not encouraging. A retreating army. a battlefield that had already been lost. He found Napoleon, and the conversation between them, whatever its exact words, carried a clear meaning. The battle was going badly, very badly. Napoleon could have continued the retreat, preserved his army, accepted the loss, regrouped. It would have been a rational decision. He did not choose that. Instead, he made a different calculation. A dangerous one. A final one. He would turn. This is the moment the battle pivots. Not because of numbers, not because of terrain, but because of decision. Desai understood the risk. He also understood the opportunity. The Austrians were advancing, but they were extended. Their lines stretched, their formations less tight than before. Victory had made them less cautious. So Desai prepared a counterattack, not to push back, to break the advance. French forces began to reform, not fully, not perfectly, but enough. The line stiffened, the retreat slowed, then stopped, and then it turned. Desai led the attack, infantry forward, into an enemy that believed the fight was over. At that exact moment, another force moved, French cavalry under Kellerman, hidden, waiting, watching. They struck the flank, not gradually, not cautiously, suddenly. This is the point where battles don't just shift, they collapse. The Austrian advance, already extended, could not absorb the shock. Infantry units, mid-movement, mid-transition, suddenly found themselves attacked from unexpected directions. Command broke. Momentum reversed. Desai was killed. Almost immediately. Shot in the opening phase of the counterattack. He would not see the result, but the result came quickly. The Austrian line faltered, then fractured, then fell back. What had been a pursuit became a retreat. What had been victory became confusion. Napoleon pushed forward, now with momentum, now with coherence, now with belief restored. By evening, the battlefield belonged to the French, and that is the version most people remember. But it is not the full story. Because the truth of Marengo is not that Napoleon won, it is how close he came to losing. For most of the day, he was outmaneuvered, outpositioned, outfought. His initial assumptions were wrong. His deployment was flawed. His reaction was late. And if Desai had not returned, if the Austrians had maintained tighter control, if the timing had shifted by even an hour, the outcome could have been very different. But history does not remember almost. It remembers outcomes, and outcomes can be shaped. Napoleon understood that better than most. After the battle, he began to tell the story, not as a desperate recovery, but as a controlled victory. The narrative emphasized design, control, inevitability. The chaos of the morning faded. The retreat became maneuver. The near defeat became strategy. Desai became a hero, but not the hero. That role remained with Napoleon, because Marengo was not just a battle. It was a foundation. It secured his position in France. It forced Austria toward negotiation. It reinforced the image of a leader who could not be defeated. And that image mattered. More than the details. More than the truth. Because power is not only built on what happens, it is built on what people believe happened. Marengo proved something essential. Not that Napoleon was infallible, but that he was capable of surviving his own mistakes and then rewriting them. That is a different kind of power, more dangerous, more enduring. Because from that point on, when people spoke of Napoleon, they did not speak of the man who almost lost at Marengo. They spoke of the man who won it. And that version of the story is the one that conquered Europe. Then the story doesn't end on the battlefield. Because Marengo was only half a victory. The other half was written afterward, carefully, deliberately, and with far greater control than anything that happened that day. In the days following the battle, Europe did not yet understand what had truly happened. Reports traveled slowly. Messengers carried fragments. Officers described what they saw, but no one saw everything. And into that uncertainty, Napoleon stepped first. He didn't describe a collapse. He didn't describe a retreat. He didn't describe a battlefield that had slipped out of his control for most of the day. Instead, he described a plan, a design, a victory that unfolded in stages exactly as intended. This wasn't accidental. Napoleon understood something that many commanders never fully grasp. Winning the battle is one thing. Owning the narrative of the battle is something else entirely. So Marengo became a different kind of story. In this version, the French army had drawn the Austrians in. In this version, the retreat was calculated. In this version, the final counterattack was not desperation, it was inevitability. And the most dangerous part? Paris didn't see confusion. Paris saw triumph. A nation that had been uncertain about its new ruler suddenly had proof, visible, undeniable proof, that Napoleon could deliver what France needed most. Austria, shaken by the sudden reversal, moved toward negotiation. The broader war shifted. Momentum, that invisible force that decides so many conflicts, tilted. And Napoleon's position solidified, not just as a general, but as a leader who could not be easily challenged. But beneath that image, the truth remained. Marengo had exposed something real, something uncomfortable. Napoleon could miscalculate. He could read a situation wrong. He could walk into a battle thinking he was in control and discover too late that he wasn't. What saved him was not perfection. It was recovery. He adapted faster than the consequences could fully close in. He had subordinates capable of independent judgment. He was willing, at the last possible moment, to risk everything on a decision that could not be undone. That combination is rare and dangerous, because it creates a leader who doesn't need to be right all the time, only right at the moment that matters most. Marengo also revealed something else. Not about Napoleon, but about power itself. Power does not depend only on reality, it depends on perception. If enough people believe a version of events, that version becomes functionally true. It shapes decisions, it shapes alliances, it shapes fear, and after Marengo, Europe began to believe something. That Napoleon could not be beaten. Not really, not completely, even when he was losing. That belief would follow him, across Italy, across Central Europe, across battlefields where commanders hesitated, not because Napoleon was unbeatable, but because they believed he might be. And hesitation, in war, is often fatal. So Marengo didn't just save a campaign, it didn't just secure a government, it didn't just win a single day. It created a myth. A myth that would carry Napoleon further than any single victory ever could. A myth that would allow him to take bigger risks, win larger wars, reshape the map of Europe. But like all myths, it had a weakness. Because myths require maintenance. They require repetition. They require consistency. And the more a leader depends on the belief in his own invincibility, the more dangerous it becomes when reality finally breaks that illusion. Years later, on very different fields far colder, far larger, far less forgiving, that illusion would begin to crack. Not all at once, but slowly, inevitably. Because Marengo was not proof that Napoleon could not lose. It was proof that he almost could. And that difference is everything. So when we look back at Marengo, we are not just looking at a victory. We are looking at a narrow escape, a miscalculation survived, a disaster rewritten, a day where history could have closed the book on Napoleon before it ever truly began, but didn't. And perhaps the most important part of the story is this: not that Napoleon won, but that he made sure the world would never remember how close he came to losing. Because in the end, the Battle of Marengo was fought twice, once on the field and once in memory. And in that second battle, Napoleon never even came close to defeat, because the deeper truth of Marengo doesn't live in the charge that won it. It lives in the hours that nearly destroyed it. Imagine the battlefield again, not at the moment of victory, but in the middle of the day. The sun high, the air thick with smoke, the sound of artillery constant, no longer distinct explosions, but a continuous pressure in the chest. Men are not thinking in terms of strategy anymore. They are thinking in fragments. Hold here, fall back, reload, stay alive. This is the version of war that doesn't make it into official reports. The version where lines blur, not just physically, but mentally. Where units lose sight of each other. Where orders arrive too late. Where officers improvise not because they are brilliant, but because they have no other choice. Napoleon stood inside that reality. Not above it, not outside it, inside it. And that matters, because it changes how we understand what happened next. When historians look back, there is a temptation to see inevitability, to look at the final outcome and trace backward a path that feels logical, clean, directed. But Marengo was not clean. It was unstable. It was a structure that almost collapsed under its own weight. Napoleon's earlier decisions had set conditions that made this collapse possible. That's the uncomfortable part. He had assumed the Austrians would retreat. That assumption shaped everything. It dictated his deployment. It justified his dispersion of forces. It created the very vulnerability that Melas exploited. This is how strategic failure often works, not as a single mistake, but as a chain. A belief that feels reasonable. A decision that follows logically from that belief. Another decision that reinforces it. Until the structure is complete and wrong. By the time Napoleon realized the truth, he was no longer shaping the battle. He was reacting to it. And reaction is always slower than intention. So when we talk about the genius of Marengo, we have to be precise. The genius was not in the opening. It was not in the positioning. It was not in the anticipation of the enemy. The genius, if we can call it that, was in the refusal to accept the consequences of failure as final. Napoleon did not fix the situation. He delayed its collapse, long enough for something else to intervene. That something else was not luck alone. It was structure. Desai was not just a fortunate arrival. He was part of a system Napoleon had built, one where subordinates had enough autonomy to act independently, enough trust to move without constant supervision. That matters. Because in many armies, a general absent from the main battle would have continued executing his original orders. He would not have turned back. He would not have risked disobeying the broader plan. Desai did. He heard the guns. He interpreted them correctly. And he made a decision that was not explicitly ordered. That decision changed everything. So the turning point at Marengo is not just about timing. It is about initiative. A system where one man's judgment can override the inertia of a flawed plan. A system flexible enough to absorb a mistake at the top. But even that was not enough on its own. Because Desai did not arrive to a stable situation. He arrived to a battlefield already slipping away. The French army was in motion, backward, under pressure. Reversing that kind of movement is one of the hardest things in war. It requires more than courage. It requires belief. And belief, at that moment, was fragile. So when Napoleon chose to turn and fight again, he was not just making a tactical decision, he was making a psychological one. He was asking his army to believe that a battle they had been losing for hours could still be won. That is not a small request. Most armies in that position continue retreating. They preserve what they can. They regroup. They try again another day. Napoleon chose the opposite. And that choice only works under very specific conditions. The enemy must be extended. The timing must be precise. The counterattack must be concentrated. At Marengo, all three conditions aligned. Barely. The Austrian advance had lost some of its cohesion, not because of incompetence, but because of success. Success stretches armies. It pulls them forward. It tempts them to pursue, to finish the fight. And in doing so, it creates vulnerability. This is the paradox of victory. The closer you get to it, the easier it is to lose control of it. Melas did not make a dramatic mistake. He made a human one. He believed the evidence in front of him. He saw an enemy retreating. He saw ground gained. He saw momentum in his favor. And he concluded, reasonably, that the battle was over. But war does not reward reasonable conclusions. It rewards relentless caution. By delegating control, by allowing the pursuit to continue without his direct oversight, Melas introduced just enough looseness into his army's structure. Not enough to fail immediately, but enough to fail under pressure. And pressure arrived in the form of a single, coordinated blow. Desai's infantry attack fixed the Austrian front, held it, engaged it. Then Kellermann's cavalry struck the flank. This is where timing becomes decisive. Too early, and the Austrians are still organized enough to respond. Too late, and the French line collapses before the attack can begin. At Marengo, it landed in the narrow window where the enemy was committed but not secured. The result was not gradual. It was sudden. Lines that had been advancing stopped, then hesitated, then broke. Momentum flipped. And once momentum flips in a battle already stretched to its limits, the reversal is violent. Units that had been pushing forward now had to turn, to reorient, to defend, without preparation. That is how victories unravel. Not in slow retreats, but in abrupt collapses. And that is what happened to the Austrians. By the end of the day, what should have been a clear, methodical victory had become a retreat. Not because they were weaker, but because at the decisive moment, they were less prepared for the unexpected. And Napoleon was. Not because he had planned it, but because he was willing to act when the opportunity appeared. That distinction matters, because it changes how we interpret the outcome. Marengo was not a demonstration of perfect strategy. It was a demonstration of strategic recovery. A leader making a series of flawed decisions, then surviving long enough to make one that mattered more than the rest. But survival is only half the equation. The other half is interpretation. After the battle, Napoleon faced a different challenge. Not the Austrians, not the terrain, not the timing, the story. He could not allow Marengo to be remembered as a near disaster, because near disasters invite doubt, and doubt is corrosive. It spreads. It undermines authority. It encourages opposition. So he reshaped the narrative. In official bulletins, in reports, In the way the battle was presented to Paris and beyond, the uncertainty disappeared. The confusion became complexity. The last-minute counterattack became the culmination of a broader design. And because the final result supported that narrative, people believed it. This is one of the most important aspects of power in the modern age. Control of information, control of perception. Napoleon was not just fighting armies, he was managing an image of inevitability, of control, of superiority. And Marengo, retold correctly, reinforced all of those things. It told allies that he was reliable. It told enemies that he was dangerous. It told the French people that their leader was exactly what they needed. And once that belief took hold, it began to shape reality. Opponents approached him differently, more cautiously, more hesitantly. Allies trusted him more, committed more. This is how myths become strategic assets. They change behavior. And in war, behavior determines outcomes. So Marengo echoes far beyond its battlefield, not because of the number of men involved, not because of the territory gained, but because of what it created. A version of Napoleon that was stronger than the man himself, a version that did not hesitate, did not miscalculate, did not almost lose. And that version went on to fight many more battles. But the reality remained underneath. Napoleon was not invincible. He was not infallible. He was a man capable of extraordinary recovery. And Marengo was the proof. The proof that he could stand at the edge of failure and step back. But also the proof that one day, in a different place, under different conditions, that step back might not be possible. Because recovery has limits, timing has limits, luck has limits. And when those limits are reached, no narrative can undo the result. Marengo sits at the beginning of that arc, a moment where everything aligned just enough, just in time. A moment where a leader survived his own mistake and turned it into legend. But if you look closely, if you strip away the story he built afterward, you can still see it. The hesitation, the retreat, the uncertainty. The version of Napoleon that almost ended before it began. And that version is just as important as the one that followed, because it reminds us of something essential. History is not shaped only by what happens. It is shaped by what is remembered. And sometimes, what is remembered is the part that was never in danger, even when it was.